This is CBS Eye on the World. Here's John Batchelor.
The United Nations, Israel. I welcome Malcolm Hoenlein, Conference of Presidents, major American Jewish organizations, to help all of us understand a decision made by the United Nations recently that very much attracts the condemnation of 21 countries plus the U.S. The headline at the Times of Israel, U.S., 21 other countries lash UN Rights Council for report blaming Israel for conflict. Subhead, American ambassador tells Human Rights Council that report condemning Jewish state is evidence of bias, quote, will further contribute to polarization. Malcolm, a very good evening to you. Malcolm Hoenlein, Conference of Presidents, major American Jewish organizations. These countries, Malcolm, these are our allies. Does the UN respond? It's been some days since the rebuke.
Virtually not at all. And, for more than 20 years, you and I have been working trying to understand the UN and figure out the decisions they reach. The bias that continues is the only consistent thing. And the person who has done the most, I think, to expose it is our guest, Hillel Neuer. This is really, people tend to dismiss the UN. And I think it's a big mistake. And this is a case in point where a lot of damage and a lot of mischief could come out of it. And Hillel has worked very hard to expose this to the world.
We welcome Hillel Neuer from Jerusalem. He's the executive director of UN Watch, a Geneva-based human rights NGO. Hillel, the condemnation was immediate and adamant. Has the UN responded? Do you expect it to respond to the doubts raised by its most significant member since the beginning?
They might. So far, what we did hear is certainly, I would say, outrage by the chair of the commission, members of the commission, and, for example, the Palestinian ambassador in Geneva. I was sitting behind him in the debate that took place last week when he called for the United States to be expelled from the Human Rights Council, right? This is a body that includes China, Cuba, Venezuela, Libya, Qatar, Mauritania, which has slavery, and it did include Russia until we spearheaded a campaign to remove them, which happened about 2 months ago. And this permanent commission of inquiry targeting Israel was created by those dictatorships. The Palestinian ambassador has no problem with that. But the moment the Americans dared to read out a joint statement, which was relatively a mild statement, calling out the bias of this commission, he was outraged. He called for the U.S. to be removed from the Human Rights Council. That's not going to happen. The U.S. didn't respond to that. Perhaps they should have. And then, again, you had the chair of the inquiry, Navi Pillay, and one or maybe both of her fellow commissioners, Milun Kutari of India and Chris Sidoti of Australia, who was a radical activist for many years. They expressed outrage at the United States. Certainly Navi Pillay was very upset. This gentleman, the commissioner, Milun Kutari, said America just joined the Human Rights Council, and it doesn't bode well that they're opposing action. They accused the United States of double standards, which was kind of amusing, given that this is a body that has one agenda item for the whole world and one agenda item against Israel alone. It's a body that has adopted more condemnations against Israel than on Iran, Syria, and North Korea combined. So if you want to talk about the pot calling the kettle black, this was this permanent commission of inquiry targeting Israel, accusing the United States of double standards.
Malcolm, you have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, hypocrisy becomes the theme of this body, and the United States pulled out, and during the Trump administration, it went back. In the Biden administration, with good intentions of trying to help from within and straighten things out. But it doesn't seem that has been the result. That the investigation, the scope of the investigation under this mandated by the Human Rights Council includes not only the Palestinian territories in East Jerusalem, but Israel itself and all violations of international humanitarian law. So there's no limit. And are we likely then to see every accusation from apartheid, BDA, everything else that cumulative charges against Israel that have been proven false will now be resurrected under the guise of a commission of the UN Human Rights Council?
Absolutely, Malcolm. I think it's quite clear that although this first report was a bit of a technical report, it recanted previous accusations made against Israel in the Goldstone report and successive biased inquiries. It's clear they're just getting started. They're just putting together their staff. They lashed out at the United States for succeeding in trimming the budget. The budget may have been trimmed by about 25%. It's still in the range of $4 to $5 million a year. It's a permanent staff sitting in Geneva whose mission is essentially to prosecute Israel, to collect evidence admissible in international courts, to send it to The Hague, to the International Criminal Court and other jurisdictions. And let us recall, who's sitting on this inquiry, because if you ask whether they're going to accuse Israel of apartheid, we know they will, because that's why they chose Navi Pillay. Navi Pillay is a person who 2 years ago petitioned governments, signed a petition that was going to governments, urging them to, and I quote, sanction apartheid Israel. So we know exactly what she's going to say. And then a year later, last year in 2021, after the Hamas-Israel war, she sent a letter, a joint letter, to President Biden, urging him to declare Israel guilty of last year's war based on its oppression and discrimination against the Palestinians, which caused the war. That is the very war that she's meant to investigate. So if you ask any lawyer in the United States who has an ounce of objectivity, they would tell you that someone like this is morally, ethically, legally obliged. She's obliged to recuse herself. And we submitted a petition of 35 pages making the case, and she declined to do anything. I went up to her last week after the debate, and I handed it to her again. And I said, we didn't get a response. And she said, well, I read it. I said, we didn't get a response. She said, oh, well, we can't reply to everything.
Hillel, the UN has authority over the Human Rights Council or not? Because it's easy for people at a distance to think the UN is condemning Israel. What does the Secretary General's office, what does the leadership at the UN make of this discord? Is it healthy for them? Can they rebuke it?
Well, it's true. You identified an important issue. When we say the UN, it can mean two different things, right? It can mean the member states who are sitting at the UN who vote and make a decision. And then there's the permanent staff who get a paycheck from the UN, starting with the Secretary General and going on down to thousands of bureaucrats in New York, Geneva, and elsewhere. They can sometimes, if they want to, the Secretary General could distance himself from a decision made by the intergovernmental forum, such as the Human Rights Council or the General Assembly. That has not happened in this case, John. The Secretary General has not at all distanced himself. And I would say that it's certainly the people who work for him in Geneva, which is the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which has been headed by Michelle Bachelet, they are involved in putting together the staff for this commission. I would probably suggest that it's probably they who wrote the short list that suggested the commissioners. So although they are separate, the intergovernmental body and the secretariat, often they have a symbiotic relationship. And when it comes to Israel, certainly in Geneva, the bureaucrats who work for Guterres are up to no good, and that's putting it mildly.
So it's a rogue outfit within the UN, and the Secretary General chooses not to discipline. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Malcolm,
this is open. I'm sorry.
About a minute. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is open-ended. What is the next step for the COI? The Human Rights Council is meeting now. Do you expect anything to happen before the GA in September, when everybody's together?
They held a press conference last week, the members of this Commission of Inquiry, which, as you indicate, is permanent. It's unlike all the others. It never ends. It looks at root causes. It's not an inquiry. It's the Inquisition. They are going to meet with the ICC, the International Criminal Court, this week. They may have already met with members of the prosecuting team there. And as you said, they're meant to report in New York. So I think we can expect a more virulent report to come out in New York in October.
Hillel Neuer, Executive Director, UN Watch, based in Geneva. Malcolm Hoenlein, Conference of Presidents. I'm John Batchelor.